So we're in the middle of an experiment trying out some more history-focused episodes, and since we had so much Talaiotic footage from Majorca and Menorca, this seemed like the perfect time to try. Now, a large chunk of the previous episode was laying the groundwork on the history, so definitely pause this and flick to the Talaiotic Majorca episode if you haven't seen that yet. One thing we didn't get to was a rough chronology of the Talaiotic cultures, so by way of a catch-up, let's do that. First of all, we now know that the Balearic Islands were colonised comparatively late. We've narrowed it down to about 2470 and 2210 BC. Citations below this. Now, I don't want to wade into the argument of the earliest humans on the Balearic Islands, not only because things like uncalibrated carbon dates are way above my pay grade, but those dates have been creeping forward in academia over the past few decades, so you'll have authors from not that long ago giving earlier dates, and it just takes a while for these to wash out of the discourse. So please, none of this, actually it was 3000 BC in the comments. There have been some much earlier dates posited. We're talking several thousand years earlier, but that was based on things like dating charcoal layers. And the thing is, turns out, not that easy to tell between wildfires as opposed to campfires, so it's not clear if that evidence is valid. Anyway, if we stick with the most up-to-date dating of 2470 to 2210, that is strikingly late as far as the Mediterranean goes. I mean, compare that to Malta, not a million miles away. The Neolithic party was pretty much wrapping up there. They'd had all their major temple phases, and this was about the time they pretty much took their ball and went home, archaeologically speaking, by which we mean they disappeared under circumstances still not fully understood. So yeah, the Balearic Islands are pretty late to the party. One potential smoking gun for this arrival is the rapid extinction of several endemic animals at once, including this cave goat. But like everything, there's still little uncertainty on the exact timing and reasons for that. Unfortunately, I don't have any of the Neolithic highlights to show you, with the possible exception of these at Torre la Fuda, but the cultures did have a fondness for megaliths that links them to mainland Iberia. But they didn't stay pen pals with the mainland for long, which means the island would develop on their own trajectory, hence all this unique architecture we get to explore. So what we see emerging through the middle to late Bronze Age, broad ballpark about 1600 to 1100 BC, are the Navetas, named as such for their boat-like shape. But we do have to be delineating between the funerary Navetas, which are specifically burial structures, and other Naveta structures which are domestic. The only Navetas that we personally got the chance to see were the funerary ones, so mostly when we say Navetas from now on, that's what we're referring to. Now, the real million-euro question is what brought about the shift in the culture of the islands from the Naveta-dwelling culture into one that was building Talaiots? And parallel to this discussion, and it's something that I hesitate to wade into because it sits right at the nexus point of all the academia around the ancient history of the Balearic Isles, but it's the degree to which the inhabitants were insular and or just how much they were affected by the rest of the Mediterranean. You have to remember, in ancient times, the sea was not a barrier. It was the superhighway of trade and communication. It was often crossing overland that was far more arduous. And the Mediterranean world was highly connected throughout antiquity. I mean, the short answer is yes, of course the Balearic Islands had contact with other cultures. I mean, this tiny bronze statue of Horus, for example, is Egyptian, though it is quite late in Talaiotic terms, something like 600 BC. In fact, even though there was copper mining happening on the island, you wouldn't get bronze on the island at all if it wasn't for trade. Just a couple of broad strokes observations. While dating Talaiotic structures is notoriously thorny, it's noteworthy that based on the dates we have for the Navetas, they were being used near continuously both before and after the time when the rest of the Mediterranean was experiencing a minor hiccup known as the Bronze Age collapse. Greece, for example, was going up in flames, and structures built on the scale of the Mycenaeans wouldn't be matched for another 500 odd years. But this disruption doesn't seem anywhere near as pronounced on the Balearic Isles. Structures are continuing to be built, life is carrying on, change would come, but it was gradual over a period of 400 plus years rather than the sudden societal dislocation you see happening in the 1100s BC elsewhere. And you don't have this same blip where the culture gets drop-kicked into a dark age. Sidebar, I tried to write something about changes in funerary culture, but there's a lot to keep track of, and it varies considerably between locations and time periods, from mass burials in Navetas to later on burials in caves and Hypogea with some more complex rituals involving hair or individuals wrapped in animal skins and placed on stretchers, and then there's these burials where the body is encased in lime. It just got away from us a bit, so we ended up cutting that. But describing the transition of cultures on the Balearic Isles has proved one of the hardest things to nail down, and the academia on the subject has shifted in recent decades. The prevailing theory used to be that the transition from Navetas to Talaiot building was triggered by the arrival of new cultures on the islands. Shout out my sea peoples! But as we've started to get a more accurate dating on the sites, spoiler alert,
spoilers from history,
this looks less and less likely, but there is a lot still up in the air. I mean, this leaves a huge amount of space for nuh-uh in the comments. I'm almost certainly going to regret even trying to outline the topic here. But in its simplest terms, the Talaiotic architecture is so unique, it invites a lot of questions about a hothouse culture like this happening in such a central location in the Western Mediterranean. I mean, while we were making the Greek comparisons a moment ago, just putting the two cultures side by side and comparing their architecture, it does make a striking comparison. And if we're asking how much the Balearic Isles were influenced by other cultures in the highly interconnected Mediterranean, it's definitely noteworthy that around the 500s BC, while the Greek states were building things like this on the Greek mainland and from Anatolia through the Cyclades and as far west as Sicily, the Talaiotic cultures were building like this. But it's definitely a very different path of development when you simply compare architectural conventions that were occurring around the same time, hence why it's so fascinating. Whew, right, just check the time code. So yes, dating, that's a rabbit hole. Anyway, suffice to say, at whatever stage or however long the transition took to occur, you start to see the construction of Talaiots at the centre of settlements. According to the bones being deposited in the funerary Navetas that we can date, the most active period of use was between about 1130 to about 820 BC, with the last deposit at the Tudons Naveta, for example, being 750 BC. So there's no hard date for the beginning of the Talaiotic period, but some of the signs on the sites put it down at about 900 BC for convenience, and that's a broad goalpost, so sure. Then, after 500 BC, we see more big changes. The construction of Talaiots has halted, and it appears the culture of the islands was changing, quite likely due to increased contact with the outside. We know that the Balearic Isles fell into the sphere of the Carthaginians, but while they set up a major settlement on Ibiza, it doesn't appear they occupied Majorca and Menorca in the same way the Romans would in 123 BC. But, as I'm sure you can tell from the discussion before, the extent of outside influence on the endemic culture is a field of ongoing study. The biggest change you see in the architecture is the arrival of a new structure, the Taula enclosure. These unmissable T-shaped uprights are a new development from this period, but, say it with me now, their use is not entirely understood. So, short version, ritual use, longer version, that, but with lots of qualifiers and unanswered questions. We're not going into the time period after this, which is where we actually start getting primary written sources about the Balearic Isles, but there is one more thing we have to bring up. So one of the things the Balearic Isles were famed for among the Carthaginians and the Romans was for producing incredibly skilled slingers. In fact, it's possible the name of the Balearic Islands comes from Balearis, or ballo, which is from the Greek meaning to launch. Diodorus of Sicily, a Greek historian, wrote, "In the practice of throwing large stones with the sling, they surpass all other men." Though unfortunately I don't have any exciting shots of slings for you, just some Ken Burns of some sling stones in the Menorca Museum. Hannibal clearly rated them highly as he took 2,000 of them on his famous assault on Italy. And after the Romans nabbed the island in 123 BC, Balearic slingers were used as units in the Roman army. Amongst other campaigns, Caesar even utilised them in the Gallic Wars. But we don't have the scope to get into the Carthaginian or Roman occupation of the islands. That's a story for another time. So that's the end of the video. Don't forget to subscribe and... just playing, but wasn't expecting that section to take quite as long. Okay, but now you've got a bit more of an idea what we're dealing with, let's take a look around some of the sites. Once again, we did our best with essentially 2.5 days, but this is what the map of Talaiotic sites on Menorca looks like. So if you're hoping for 100% completion, well, you go right ahead and be my guest. I just hope you've packed enough sandwiches. Suffice to say, I'm pretty happy that in the time we had, we hit most of the main sites. Can't think of any special order to place these in, so we'll literally just hit them in the same order that we did. beginning with the Talaiots de Dault. Now, there is a lot to see here. In fact, we're pretty lucky that this site has a bit of everything to get us started. On your way in, you see these caves, which, while originally natural caves, have been augmented. I mean, the wall is modern, but the inside was used as a mixed cemetery. Then the centre of the site is the Talaiot. It's possible this was originally hollow and has been backfilled over the centuries, but we're not certain. What really steals the show is the Taula enclosure. The central Taula is 3.7 metres tall from the floor to the top of the capstone, which is an impressive 3.8 metres long, and it's got a friend leaning on it there, which definitely makes it one of the more recognisable on the islands. And hey, here's a chance to see if you were paying attention last episode. These domestic structures, which are held up by a series of pillars, that makes them hipper style. Yes, give yourself a round of applause. It doesn't look like much at first, but these may be the most interesting feature of the whole site. This labyrinth of structures is surprisingly complex. When you think you've seen all of it, you turn the corner and it just keeps on going. These areas have been interpreted as storage areas and workshops, though it appears there was all sorts happening. Speaking of pillars, by the way, at first glance, it seems to defy logic that a pillar holding up a ceiling would have an even larger rock balanced on top. But there you are. You have much the same thing at Galmers, which we'll get to in a bit. While we're on the topic of roofs, something that's been debated for years, were the Taulas actually roof supports? I mean, it's possible you weren't thinking that at all, but when you look at some of the enclosures, and it's like, yeah, I mean, I guess that might work. It seems strange to have a wall this high to then not have a roof sheltering the inside. However, despite the Talaiotic fondness for making ceilings out of just the heaviest, most difficult materials, the interpretation has now pretty much ruled out the Taula enclosures being roofed. Although, of course, it's not 100% certain, a big part of it remains the large fires discovered there, and it's just hard to see how a straw roof would last with that going on underneath. This structure at the entrance, at a glance, looks like some sort of grand ceremonial archway, but apparently these are the remains of domestic structures. Archaeology has unearthed evidence of amphorae of wine along with goat and lamb bones at the Dault site, so it seems like life there was pretty good. And even though its main phase of settlement appears to decline with the arrival of the Romans, there's evidence of habitation even up to the Islamic era on the island, so that's all the way into the Middle Ages. Okay, since the Talaiots de Dault site had quite a bit of everything, it's a good chance to check out some Navetas. And just down the road, Rafael Ruby has two, just a few yards from each other, which is actually somewhat unusual. They're in pretty good condition if you consider they're pushing 3,000 years old. Now, dating sites like this can be a pain. There's no shortage of people who want to make different usage of sites like this over the subsequent centuries, whether it's reusing a burial chamber 1,000 or more years later to bury your own dead. For example, the burial chambers on Guernsey are quite famous for that. They were reused for burials across different eras. But then again, they also got used as ammo dumps by the occupying German forces during World War II. Probably the most popular manner that megalithic graves above a certain size get reused is simply to shelter livestock, and that's what happened to the southern Naveta, which was used to shelter cattle. That would be before it was restored. Can't see getting many cows through this doorway. Then, of course, there's the chance that someone has already had the bright idea of having a dig in there for themselves, which is what happened with the northern Naveta, which is always a downer, not just because of the potential of what's been lost, but because the soil layers are all disturbed, and soil placement is one of the primary tools for accurate dating. I mean, you can see they haven't survived at height. They may have actually been 4 meters tall originally, and they had an upper and lower floor. Using the Naveta de Tudons as a guide, there could have been as many as 100 bodies in these. Speaking of dead people, after this we headed west to the necropolis of Calamorel. Now this is beautiful. It's a set of caves that have been carved and sculpted for use as burial chambers. Now, if you were to take an educated guess, you'd probably assume, well, early human beings lived in caves, so these would be the most ancient remains on the island, yeah? And then later people would progress to building their own structures. Well, first of all, it's a bit of a misnomer. Of course, there has been human habitation in caves, but for most of human history, we've been more than happy to make our own dwellings. We've not been dependent on just caves. But the biggest asterisk here is that this is a necropolis. These were created for the dead, not as dwellings. The earliest work here goes back to about 1600 BC, so that's pretty early in Talaiotic terms. But it actually had its busiest period of expansion around the 500s BC during the tail end of the Talaiotic period and into the post-Talaiotic. And these aren't just functional plain chambers, as you might assume. These carved capitals are often taken as evidence of the Balearic Isles' connection with the outside Mediterranean world. It appears there's inspiration from other cultures going on here. I mean, there's no utility in carving that. It's there as a specific artistic choice, reflecting the tastes of the time. And there appears to be some ancestor veneration taking place here, with offerings being made. Anyway, it's a really unique place. Really enjoyed this one. Rolling over to the next day, we were starting from Cittadella, right on the western edge. So first thing, Talaiots de Montefi. This would have been a pretty sizable settlement compared to what we've seen so far. There's 3 Talaiots visible here, as well as some cave necropolises. Yes, that is the correct plural. Apparently there were other structures visible as recently as the early 20th century, but these got demolished to make the area better for agriculture. So some of the boundary walls you can see are made of stones pinched from these ancient structures. Side note, by the way, Menorca is absolutely covered in dry stone walls. It's just the standard way to delineate a field, but unsurprisingly, few of these are of any significant antiquity. However, because many of the Talaiotic structures were built in much the same way, you'll quickly get in the habit of staring at a wall, thinking you're looking at some ancient structure before realising it's just the boundary to the car park, and the actual ancient monument is 200 yards that way. Okay, well, short way down the road, and the golden child of Menorcan ancient history, the Naveta de Tudons. And yeah, it's a Naveta in very good shape, thanks to a 20th century restoration. Again, dating these is not easy. It's an ossuary that contained around 100 skeletons, and these have been carbon dated to between 1200 and 750 BC, but the structure might be earlier than that still. Funnily enough, while Tudons is very striking, it has the Petra problem, where the outside is just begging you to see what's within, and it turns out, well, not much, at least not anymore. Yeah, I'm going to plug my other episodes. Since you asked, go watch the Petra episode. It's pretty great. And yes, the inside of the Naveta de Tudons is not going to change your life. Almost feel like I'm spoiling the site here.
Spoilers from history.
But if you're anything like me, seeing pictures or footage of other places doesn't make me say, oh, well, I've seen it now, I guess I don't need to visit. In fact, this whole trip only happened because I saw some picture of Taulas and I couldn't resist the urge to go and see them for myself. Well, moving along, and once again barely any distance down the road, the Torrella Fuda Talaiot is somewhat overgrown. There were some ground workers with jerry cans of petrol burning piles of recently chopped foliage while we looked around. The Talaiots in pretty good shape. This one is actually a good one to catch a view from the top. There's a Taula standing under the trees, and there's a fortifying wall around the edge of the site which has survived quite well. These stones on your way to the site that may be earlier standing stones, or they might just be some rocks. I've not been able to find out either way. I would say more on this site, but that would take running time away from the next one, which is an absolute monster. So this is Torre den Galmes, and this has got to be one of the most extensive sites on the island. There's just so much going on here, and you can see large sections where excavations are either ongoing or incomplete. The Talaiots themselves are kind of some of the least impressive parts. They're a bit tumble down, but they're standing still at a pretty impressive height, and there's 3 of them in a cluster at the top of the site. On your way in, you can see the domestic structures at the base of the Talaiots, but as you get further around the site, this is if you're going anti-clockwise, it just keeps getting better. This is the Taula enclosure made from huge megaliths. Not to confuse things, but the Taula is no longer upright. It's actually here on the floor. You can see the original socket where it would have sat on the central pillar. In a space as impressive as this, you can more clearly see why the question of were the Taula enclosures roofed is rather close to call. This does look like a space that could be a sealed room. On the other hand, the next set of structures definitely did have a roof on them. These dwellings are remarkably well preserved. Huge door lintels lead into domestic spaces that are compartmentalised. I couldn't quite get my head around what the info boards were describing at first, but then I saw this reconstruction. It's believed that these enclosures opened into a central courtyard from which the different sections or compartments fanned out around the edge. Not a historical or geographical comparison, as these 2 sites are separated by about 2,000 kilometres and about 3,000 years, but the site did remind me of something like a Mediterranean Skara Brae, with its intimate domestic details and the compartments where people worked or slept. I don't know, just as the discovery of Skara Brae really short-circuits you right into the domestic life in the Neolithic, the structures of Galmes really allow you to step into life in post-Talaiotic Menorca. You can even see some of the water storage systems they used. Bearing in mind, this southern section is down the hill from the upper parts of the settlement where the Talaiots are, and there's an interconnected system which is actually filtering the water before it ends up in the larger cisterns. You can see just from the sheer amount that's there just how important Galmes was as a settlement. And while it's hard to see, one of these lesser preserved structures actually shows evidence of occupation during the Islamic period on the island, with evidence of a kitchen area. So even up to medieval times, this site was still being lived in. That's pushing 2,000 years of continuous occupation, only being abandoned after the end of the Islamic era from about 1287 AD. And we are still not done. One of the most striking structures on the site is the hypostyle chamber. I mentioned this earlier, and I'm definitely no structural engineer. I'm not really a historian either, but this looks like the hardest way you could possibly employ to put a roof over an area. Still, it's spectacular. You can see those stone capitals just below the ceiling. We're not 100%, but it is believed this was actually a storage structure. Now, just to keep this in context, all of the most striking parts of Galmes that we've been through, so the Taular enclosure, these structures, and these structures, they're all post-Talaiotic era, so ballpark 500 BC onwards. Oh, and there's a cave on the way out. In fact, there's actually several caves around the site to the point where I've started to get them all mixed up. But Galmes, it's probably the most extensive and impressive site on Menorca. It just has everything. Well, not as much luck with the next one. This one was annoying. So, Torralba den Salort, this was closed. So all we could do was peer in from the gate, which was especially frustrating, as while the Talaiot is not so special, the Taulas are particularly impressive. I mean, at least we got a shot. I've not got a world-beating zoom on me, but I mean, it's not nothing. I mean, you can't say we didn't try. But not at all far away, a fitting consolation prize, the Taula of Torralisavel. Now, this one is unusual as it's surrounded by such a substantial wall with this passageway to access the centre. Now, to be clear, this is just a Taula enclosure, whatever it might look like. There is a Talaiot nearby, but I didn't actually get a snap of it. Apparently, it's pretty overgrown. The signs on the site confirm that this has been augmented in the 20th century, but seems to be agnostic as to how much, suggesting there was an ancient structure there to begin with, which is denoted by the megaliths built into it, and the Taular inside is pretty spectacular. I mean, just look at it. Well, we were nearly finished for day 2, but while we were on the eastern end of the island, we had to make sure to catch this one. And if you were starting to get the feeling that the Talaiots all look a bit similar, well, check this one out. The Talaiot di Torello, this is probably the tallest Talaiot we have, and it is quite something. It's about 10 metres in height. You can see the lintel of the doorway to some sort of structure that may have originally been on top of the Talaiot. It's extremely close to the airport. In fact, you can actually see it from the terminal. We're just lucky they didn't demolish it entirely. I mean, I learned later that in the process of building Majorca Airport in the 1960s, they destroyed Son Oms, which is a pretty significant Talaiotic site. Just straight up bulldozed the thing. And sadly, when it came time to construct Menorca's airport, this site didn't escape the builders either. There was formerly a lot more to this site, including the foundations of houses and a pair of hypogeums. You can see a few extant structures just at the foot of the Talaiot, which itself, thankfully, escaped with just this signal light plonked on the top. But this did destroy the remains of whatever structure was on top of there, which still sucks. Heading back, there was just one more site to catch that day. Son Catlar is just a short way south of Citadella. Now, I'm constantly at risk of being called a filthy casual, so this is where I feel like I'm going to get in trouble. As this whole video series has been pointing out, the Talaiotic sites on the Balearic Isles are really impressive in size and scope and just general wow factor. I mean, sure, I don't expect everyone to be head over heels about them, but still, all but the really dumbest of tourists can at the very least be like, yeah, sure, I can get what the fuss is about. You know, ancient lost civilization, mysterious stone ruins. I mean, goodness knows enough pulp novels and screenplays have been greenlit over less. But when we get to Son Catlar, we run into the trouble I mentioned all the way back at C'est Passé. There's just a lot of rubble around. It's much harder, first of all, to get footage that doesn't just look like mashed potato. But while I hate to say it, for this reason, Son Catlar is a bit harder to get excited about. It doesn't really have much of a focal point, apart from maybe the perimeter wall, which is one of the most intact on the island. But the Talaiot is almost entirely broken down, the Taular enclosure is pretty wrecked compared to the other ones at different sites, and yes, because the site has a lot of trees and bushes weaving in and out of the ruins, it's hard to get a sense of what you're looking at. Yeah, I know, this guy doesn't understand history. I've just got to be honest, even though this is a significant site, not only for its size, but its fortification with bastions and other features uniquely demonstrating the culture in transition, for most people, this one will be harder to get enthused about. But I'm going to move on before the historians start throwing their shoes at me. Flick over to the last day, and this is the last one, at least the last we had a chance to get to. Just outside Mayo is Trepuco. Now, something rather bonkers about this site, you don't really notice it at first. There's a fair number of dry stone walls around the site, but that's not that unusual. I mean, basically all the Talaiotic sites have them. It just doesn't seem that noteworthy until you see the site from above, and you'll notice, okay, what's that? So yeah, it turns out this site was selected to be turned into a star fort in the 1700s by the Spanish while they were fighting the British forces on the island. The site did originally have fortifications around it, which is possibly why the Spanish chose it. You can just about see them around the second Talaiot in the northwest of the site, which survives at a much lower height, but has lots of structures visible at its base, and there's some interesting domestic details which have survived. The most impressive parts of the site are the huge Talaiot at the centre and the Taula enclosure. It is unfortunate in the 1930s, when the site was being excavated and the Taula was being restored, they added this rather ugly chunk of concrete reinforcement. But then again, the thing that makes Taulas somewhat uncanny is the way they stand upright with a huge weight balanced seemingly precariously at the top, when it looks specifically engineered to fall over at any moment. And with that, we pretty much just had time to see the museum in Mayo, the footage of which we've been using throughout these videos, and then it was time up. So with that, we are closing out, but I want to leave a couple of place markers here, because if you'll give us the latitude of a couple of hundred years, it's interesting to compare what was going on around Europe at about the same time. While architecture in the Balearic Islands looked like this, in Britain it looked more like this, and we've actually been working on some episodes around hill forts. And while these are not done yet, I'm getting really impatient to put those out, so with any luck, before long, they might land in a playlist below these. Not only that, but we made the side-by-side comparison with classical era Greece, which is roughly contemporary to the transition from Talaiotic to post-Talaiotic periods. And again, it's a huge topic, but that would definitely be exciting to make. In the meantime, we've got more travel episodes to come too. I mentioned Skara Brae earlier, and next episode, in a pretty stark contrast, we're heading to the Orkney Isles. We've also produced all the music you've heard on these episodes, and the Talaiotic EP is now up on Bandcamp. But we've been pulling in other tracks from our catalogue, so have a listen to some of those as well. If you want to support the channel, that's the place to do it. Otherwise, we'll catch you all very soon.